Friends, thank you for being here today. We live in an era of noise where the daily news cycle bombards us with isolated events, a bank failure here, a spike in inflation there, a new government spending bill somewhere else. It can feel chaotic, unpredictable, and frankly frightening for anyone trying to protect a lifetime of hard-earned savings. But there is a signal amidst the noise. What if I told you that the financial turbulence we are experiencing right now is not a random series of unfortunate events, but the precise mathematical conclusion of a 2,000-year-old pattern? And what if the security of your retirement depends not on the dollar amount in your savings account, but on understanding exactly how this cycle has reset civilization 5 times before? To answer these questions, we must look beyond the talking heads on cable news and turn our gaze to history. History does not whisper, it shouts. There is a pattern that has reset civilization 5 times in the last 2 millennia. I do not mean it reformed the economy or adjusted the stock market. I mean a complete reset. The total erasure of debts through hyperinflation, Jubilee, or war. It happened in ancient Rome in 33 AD. It happened in medieval Europe in 1347. It happened in revolutionary France in 1789, Weimar Germany in 1923, and post-war Europe in 1953. 5 times. 5 different eras, 5 different methods. But the exact same 6-stage sequence led to the same conclusion: total debt annihilation. Each time, the leaders of the day promised the debts were manageable. Each time, the mathematicians quietly proved it was impossible. And each time, reality won. The debt was erased, destroying the savings of ordinary people and transferring wealth on a scale that makes today billionaires look like amateurs. Today, we are walking that same path. We are not guessing, we are observing. By understanding this pattern, we can answer the most critical question for your financial future. Why do only specific financial positions survive when the music stops? This brings us to the unspoken rule of history. The 2,000-year cycle. We tend to think of our modern financial system as sophisticated and unique. We have computers, algorithms, and central banks run by PhDs. We believe we have outgrown the crude economic collapses of the past. But human nature does not change, and neither does the math of leverage. The thesis we must confront is uncomfortable but undeniable. Civilization hits a reset button on its economy periodically. This is not a bug in the system. It is a feature of how human societies handle debt. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow money, you're pulling consumption forward from the future into the present. This works beautifully until the pile of promises to pay becomes larger than the economy or S ability to produce. To understand the urgency, let us look at the current reality and the numbers of 2025. The numbers are so large they become abstract, so let's contextualize them. Global debt has reached $335 trillion. That is a number with 12 zeros. To put that in perspective, the annual global economic output, the sum of all goods and services produced by every human being on Earth, is only about $90 trillion. The world owes 3 times more than it creates. I want to pause here for a moment because this is the core of the problem. When you hear these numbers, $335 trillion in debt against a $90 trillion economy, what goes through your mind? Do you feel that this is sustainable, or do you feel the pressure of this debt in your own daily life through prices and inflation? Please take a moment to leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read through them, and it is vital to know if what you are seeing on Main Street matches what I am seeing in the data. In the United States alone, the numbers are staggering. The national debt stands at $36 trillion. But that is just the government. Add in student loans at $1.7 trillion, auto loans at $1.6 trillion, credit card debt at $1.2 trillion, and corporate debt at $11 trillion. The problem is not that we have debt. The problem is the ratio. When debt grows faster than the economy for decades, you reach a mathematical event horizon. We are currently at 335% of GDP globally. History tells us that once an economy crosses the threshold of 250% debt to GDP, it creates a drag so severe that the economy can no longer grow its way out of the hole. We are well past that point. It is mathematically impossible for this debt to be repaid in real terms. There is not enough productivity in the pipeline to cover the promises we have made. When this happens, when the ledger cannot be balanced with money, it is balanced by a reset. In economic terms, this is often called a Jubilee. The concept comes from the Bible, Leviticus 25, where debts were forgiven every 50 years to prevent society from collapsing under the weight of indentured servitude. But whether it is done for religious reasons, political necessity, or sheer chaotic force, the result is the same. The slate is wiped clean. The only variable is how the slate is wiped and who gets wiped out with it. If you take nothing else away from this discussion, remember that history shows there are only 3 ways a sovereign debt crisis ends. There is no fourth option. Politicians will try to invent a fourth option, usually a mix of taxes and austerity. But when the debt is this large, those measures are like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The math eventually forces one of three outcomes. The first method is the inflationary way, or hyperinflation. This is the most common choice for governments that borrow in their own currency, like the United States. When the government cannot pay its bills and refuses to default openly, it prints the difference. This is what happened in Weimar Germany in 1923. Facing crushing war reparations and domestic debt, the German government simply turned on the printing presses. Initially, it felt like relief. Government workers got paid, and the stock market actually soared in nominal terms. But soon, the currency lost its tether to reality. We have all seen the photos of people pushing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. But what was actually happening financially? The debt was being paid. The German government technically paid off its mortgages and bonds, but they paid them with currency that was worthless. For the saver, the person who had worked 40 years to put money in a bank account, this was a death sentence. Their balance didn't change, but their purchasing power dropped to zero. Hyperinflation is effectively 100% tax on liquid assets. It clears the national debt by destroying the national currency. The second method is the political way, often called a Jubilee. This is when the government explicitly states, we are not paying, or more politely, we are restructuring. A prime example is the London Debt Agreement of 1953, post-World War II. Germany was buried under impossible debt loads, reparations from two wars and reconstruction loans. The Western Allies realized that crushing Germany again would only lead to more extremism, a lesson learned from the failure of the Treaty of Versailles. So, the United States, Britain, and France agreed to a Jubilee. They canceled 50% of West Germany's debt. They simply drew a line through the ledger. For Germany, this was a miracle that sparked the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. But for the creditors, the banks and nations that had lent that money, it was a total loss. In a Jubilee, the debtor is saved and the creditor is sacrificed. If you hold bonds during a Jubilee, your asset becomes dust. The third method is the destructive way, war. War acts as a massive reset mechanism. Sometimes this is a physical war between nations, and sometimes it is a war against nature, like a pandemic. Consider medieval Europe in 1347. The banking houses of Italy had lent massive sums to the monarchs of Europe. The kings could not pay. The system was on the brink of a financial collapse similar to 2008. Then the Black Death arrived. Within 3 years, 30% to 50% of the population died. The plague killed the bankers, it killed the debtors. It created such a massive shortage of labor that the feudal system itself collapsed. The debts became unenforceable because the society that created them effectively ceased to exist. War achieves the same grim calculus. It destroys the physical capital and the political structures that enforce debt contracts. When the dust settles, the debt is irrelevant because the world has been rebooted. These three outcomes are the destinations. But how do we get there? We follow a 6-stage roadmap. History shows us a clear cycle that functions with the precision of a metronome. Understanding which stage we are in today is the key to protecting your assets. It always begins with stage 1, the illusion of prosperity. Every crisis begins with a boom. This is the fun part of the cycle. Central banks make credit cheap and easy. Governments encourage borrowing. We saw this in ancient Rome when Augustus established the empire and credit markets exploded. We saw it in the 1920s in the US, and we saw it again from 1980 to 2008. During stage 1, debt creates the illusion of wealth. When a family takes out a loan to buy a boat, they feel richer because they have a boat. The economy registers the purchase as growth. But no wealth was created. Consumption was just pulled forward. For the last 40 years, the Western world has been in a massive stage 1 expansion. We built suburbs, funded wars, and subsidized standards of living through the credit card of national debt. It felt like prosperity, but it was actually leverage. Eventually, the borrowing hits a wall in stage 2, the tipping point. Economists have identified a specific threshold when total debt exceeds roughly 250% of GDP. Why 250%? Because at that level, the debt service, the interest payments, starts to consume the resources needed for productive growth. Money that should go into building factories, researching cures, or fixing bridges instead goes to paying bondholders. We crossed this Rubicon globally around 2010, right after the great financial crisis. Instead of paying down debt, the world doubled down. Governments printed money to stimulate the economy, pushing us deeper into the hole. By 2022, global debt hit 350% of GDP. We have been living in stage 2 for over a decade, and the drag on the economy is visible everywhere. It is why, despite trillions in stimulus, real growth feels sluggish and the middle class feels squeezed. This leads us inevitably to stage 3, the debt trap, which is where we are right now. This is the stage that should keep you up at night. Stage 3 occurs when the interest payments on existing debt consume all new economic growth. It is a mathematical doom loop. Let's look at the United States federal budget. In 2024, the U.S. government spent nearly $900 billion on interest payments alone. That is more than the entire defense budget. It is approaching the cost of Social Security. Think about that. The greatest military power in history now spends more paying off its creditors than it does on its military. The math is simple and brutal. The U.S. economy grows by maybe $600–700 billion a year in real terms. If interest payments are $900 billion, we are running backward. Every dollar of new wealth created by American workers is instantly confiscated to pay interest on money spent years ago. When you are in stage 3, you cannot grow your way out of debt. You can only borrow more to pay the interest, which makes the debt pile grow faster, which makes the interest higher. It is a Ponzi scheme, and like all Ponzi schemes, it works until it doesn't. Then comes stage 4, the recognition. This is a psychological shift. It is the moment when the smart money realizes the game is over. In 1788, just before the French Revolution, the French finance minister, Jacques Necker, did something radical. He published the budget. For the first time, the public saw the numbers. They saw that 60% of tax revenue was going to debt service. It became obvious to every merchant, baker, and aristocrat that the king was insolvent. We are entering stage 4 today. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, releases reports showing the U.S. debt trajectory going vertical. Major investors, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks are starting to quietly diversify away from U.S. treasuries. They are buying gold. They are buying land. Why? Because they can do the math. They know that a debt that cannot be paid won't be paid. As the realization sets in, we enter stage 5, political pressure and social unrest. Society begins to fracture. The population doesn't necessarily understand the complexities of the bond market, but they feel the pain. They feel the inflation. They see the inequality. Political pressure builds for a reset. We see this today in the fierce debates over student loan forgiveness. What is that? It is a demand for a mini Jubilee. We see it in the rising populism on both the left and the right. The left argues that the debt is illegitimate and predatory, demanding taxes on the rich to pay it off. The right argues that the currency is being debased and government spending is theft. Both sides are angry, and both sides feel the system is rigged. In ancient Rome, this manifested as riots between the patricians, creditors, and the plebeians, debtors. In 1789, France, it led to the guillotine. Stage 5 is when the social contract breaks down because the financial contract has already been broken. And finally, we arrive at stage 6, the reset. The pressure becomes too great, the math becomes too impossible, and the system snaps. This is the moment of the reset. It is when the government chooses one of the 3 methods we discussed: inflation, Jubilee, or war. Historically, stage 6 usually arrives within 3 to 7 years after stage 3 becomes undeniable. We entered the acute phase of stage 3 in 2020 with the COVID stimulus and the subsequent inflation. That puts the window for the Great Reset somewhere between 2023 and 2027. We are living in the shadow of stage 6 right now. Well, when stage 6 arrives, we must ask, who are the winners and losers? It is the most significant financial event of our lifetimes. But it is crucial to understand that wealth is rarely destroyed during a reset. It is transferred. It moves from one group of people to another. For those of you over 60, this is the most critical part of the analysis. The standard financial advice, the 60-40 portfolio, holding cash for safety, relying on fixed income, is designed for a stable system. It is designed for stage 1. It is catastrophic in stage 6. First, let's identify who gets wiped out. The first group is the savers, or those holding cash. If the government chooses method 1, inflation, which is the most likely path for the United States, cash is trash. You might feel safe seeing $100,000 in your bank account, but if inflation runs at 15% or 20% for a few years, the purchasing power of that money is cut in half. You haven't lost a single dollar, but you have lost half your wealth. The second group is fixed income retirees. If you rely on a fixed pension, an annuity, or Social Security, you are in the crosshairs. These payments are nominal. The check stays the same size, but the cost of milk, electricity, and medicine doubles. In the Weimar hyperinflation, pensioners starved because their fixed monthly payments couldn't buy a cup of coffee. The third group is the creditors. If you own bonds, you are a creditor. You have lent money to the government or a corporation. In a reset, creditors are the bag holders. If there is a Jubilee, your bond is canceled. If there is inflation, you are paid back in worthless currency. But on the other side of the ledger, there are those who survive. The first survivors are the debtors. This is counterintuitive. We are taught that debt is bad. But during an inflationary reset, fixed rate debt is a gift. Imagine you owe $200,000 on a house with a 30-year fixed mortgage at 3%. If inflation spikes to 20%, wages and prices eventually rise to meet it. The second survivors are hard asset owners. These are the people who own things that cannot be printed. Real estate, gold, silver, commodities, productive businesses. When the currency collapses, the price of these assets measured in that currency skyrockets. A house is a house. Its utility doesn't change. If the dollar collapses, the house might cost $10 million, but it still provides shelter. It preserves wealth. And the ultimate winners are the prepared. Those who see the pattern and move out of the loser categories and into the winner categories before the crisis hits. So, how do we position ourselves? There are 3 strategies that survive. We cannot stop the cycle. The forces driving this are geopolitical and mathematical, far beyond the control of any individual. But we can position ourselves to not just survive, but potentially thrive. Based on the 5 previous historical resets, there are 3 specific positions that have consistently protected wealth. Position 1 is ownership of hard assets. This means owning real, tangible value. In every crisis, from the collapse of Rome to the German hyperinflation, those who held paper assets lost, while those who held hard assets survived. What is a hard asset? It is something with intrinsic utility. Residential real estate is key because people always need a place to live. Even in the Great Depression, while asset prices fell, the utility of a home remained. Gold and silver are the only forms of money that are not someone else's liability. They are insurance to stay rich. And productive land like farmland produces essential goods that will always be in demand. The goal here is to minimize your exposure to financial abstractions and maximize your exposure to physical reality. Position 2 is becoming a strategic debtor. This is the most controversial but historically validated strategy. As we discussed, in an inflationary reset, the debtor wins. However, this requires nuance. I'm not suggesting you run up credit card debt to buy vacations. That is bad debt, with variable interest rates that will crush you. I am talking about strategic fixed-rate debt attached to a cash-flowing or hard asset. If you have a 30-year mortgage at a low interest rate, do not rush to pay it off. That mortgage is an asset. It is a short position on the dollar. As the dollar loses value, the real burden of that debt vanishes. You are effectively letting inflation pay off your house for you. In Weimar Germany, the smartest industrialists borrowed massively in marks to buy factories just before the hyperinflation. When the currency collapsed, they paid off their loans with the equivalent of pocket change, and they owned the factories free and clear. Position 3 is to become a liquidity minimalist. The instinct during scary times is to go to cash. We think of cash as safety. In a deflationary crash like 1929, cash is king, but in a sovereign debt crisis like 2025, cash is the victim. You must become a liquidity minimalist. This means holding only what you absolutely need for short-term survival, perhaps 3 to 6 months of living expenses, in cash. The rest should be deployed into assets that can float. Think of your cash like an ice cube in a warm room. It is constantly melting due to inflation. If you leave it there for 5 years, it will be a puddle. You need to move that water into a container that won't leak. And how do you know when to execute these shifts? Watch the bond market. Specifically, watch the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury. If rates begin to spike uncontrollably, rising above 6% or 7% despite the Federal Reserve trying to keep them down, it means the creditors are revolting. It means stage 6 has begun. That is your signal that the dam is breaking. But before we conclude, we must confront a psychological barrier that prevents 99% of people from acting on this information. The trap of normalcy bias and standard advice. You see, knowing the history is the easy part. The hard part is believing it can happen to us, here and now. This is called normalcy bias. It is the mental short circuit that occurs when the brain refuses to process a disaster because it has never experienced one before. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, many passengers refused to get into the lifeboats. Why? Because the deck of the ship still felt solid. The band was still playing. The lights were still on. To leave the safety of the giant ship for a tiny dark lifeboat in the freezing ocean seemed irrational. They waited until the ship tilted. By then, it was too late. In our financial lives, the solid deck is the traditional advice you have heard for 40 years. It is the advice to stay the course. It is the advice to maintain a 60-40 portfolio. 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Friends, I need you to listen very carefully. In a stage 6 reset, the 60-40 portfolio is not a lifeboat, it is an anchor. Why? Because the 40%, the bonds, are claims on debt. A treasury bond is nothing more than a promise from the government to pay you back in future dollars. If the government is resetting its debt through inflation, those bonds are certificates of confiscation. You are guaranteed to get your principal back, but you're also guaranteed that the principal will buy significantly less than it does today. If inflation runs at 10% and your bond pays 4%, you are losing 6% of your wealth every single year. That is a negative real yield. It is a slow bleed that drains your retirement without you seeing a single red number on your statement. And this brings us to the boiling frog phenomenon. Hyperinflation in a developed economy like the United States will likely not look like Zimbabwe overnight. It will look like sticky inflation. It starts with groceries costing 15% more. Then insurance premiums jump 20%. Then property taxes rise. It feels manageable at first. You cut back on steak, you drive less. But over 5 years, compounded inflation of 15% destroys 50% of your purchasing power. Half of your life's work gone. Not stolen by a thief, but evaporated by the reset. The trap is thinking you have time to wait for confirmation. You might think, I'll wait until things get really bad, then I'll buy gold or move my money. But history has one final warning for us: capital controls. In the late stages of a currency crisis, governments do not just stand by and watch you sell their currency. They lock the exits, they implement windfall profits taxes on gold, they restrict how much money you can wire abroad, they implement price controls that create shortages. When the crisis becomes obvious to everyone, the door to safety is usually already nailed shut. The only people who get through are the ones who walked through while the door was still wide open, while the neighbors were still laughing at them for being paranoid. Do not let the normalcy of today blind you to the mathematics of tomorrow. The band is still playing, the lights are still on, but the ship has already struck the iceberg. The water is rising in the lower decks, stage 3, and soon the tilt will begin. If you are finding value in this historical perspective and want to stay updated on how this cycle progresses, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We are tracking this stage by stage, and I want you to be part of that journey so you are not caught off guard. This leads us to our final lesson. Be early, not on time. Friends, the history of the last 2,000 years teaches us one undeniable lesson. The math always wins. Governments can kick the can down the road. They can use accounting tricks. They can print trillions. But eventually, the debt must be reconciled with reality. We are currently living through the end of a massive debt supercycle. We have passed the illusion of stage 1, ignored the warnings of stage 2, and are now trapped in the mathematical inevitability of stage 3. The reset is coming. It is not a matter of if, but when and how. It is easy to feel helpless in the face of such massive forces, but you are not helpless. You have the advantage of history. You have the advantage of foresight. The vast majority of people, your neighbors, your former colleagues, perhaps even your financial advisor, are operating under the assumption that the future will look like the past. They are holding the assets that worked in the last 40 years. They are unprepared for the regime change that is underway. The key to survival is not to panic, but to position. It is to recognize that the dollar in your pocket is not a store of value, but a wasting asset. It is to understand that true wealth lies in the ownership of real things and the strategic management of debt. Do not wait for the news anchor to tell you the crisis has started. By then, it will be too late. The transfer of wealth happens quickly, and it happens to those who are standing still. Wealth transfers from those who believe the promises to those who understand the math. Be the person who understands the math. Be early. Because when the music stops, there are only 3 chairs left, and you need to be sitting in one of them. Thank you.